Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host Chris, alongside my co-host Dean. And for today's show, we're going to do things a little differently today. We're going to finally have me share my personal experiences that I went through growing up in that home and go into other things that I experienced that one could say was strange or paranormal while growing up in general. But before we get started with today's show, we have a couple of housekeeping items. Recently this week, we've gotten a couple of emails from our listeners asking specific questions about episode 26, which focuses on the time slip theory and those time slip experiences that seem to be a popular one for this week, Dean. I'd say we just dive right in and get into these emails. And before I do that, super excited that people reached out to us. It's awesome.
It's mind blowing actually. I think I've said this on earlier recordings like way back when, because there was a time earlier in this process of the podcast where we were starting to get more and more downloads and listens. We got to this exciting level, which I know isn't like a huge deal really, like when you look at the grand scheme of like successful podcasts. But like it took us so long to get even just like 1,000 downloads or whatever, and then suddenly we had like more than that in a week. Like we went like months to get 1,000, then suddenly boom, more and more people are listening, and it kind of just like came in a whirlwind. And as we get more listeners, we get more engagement from you guys and gals listening, and this is going to be our first opportunity where we can read some questions that, or some insights or ideas that people send us. So feel free to do the same thing. Like you have our email, you can find our email posted on our pages or on our recordings. And all you have to do is just like you can send the most colloquial, simplistic input or question, and we'll be able to read it like we're about to read these ones now and kind of address them and touch on them. And it might be interesting for people to hear what others are saying or thinking about. So we have two today. We have one from Eric and one from Danielle. So let's start with Eric. Do you want to read out his email?
Sure. And Eric, thank you for reaching out to us. So Eric says, I got hooked onto your podcast after you were on the Real Life Ghost Stories podcast. Shout out to Emma for having me on. It was an awesome experience. And I appreciate all the listeners that have come from her listening base. So much appreciated, everyone. Eric goes on, I was listening to episode 26 where y'all were talking about time slips. I was wondering if you believe in the multiverse theory, and if you do, could it be possible that time slips are actually a thin veil of the universe and people are seeing another version of Earth that isn't as advanced as ours? What are your thoughts on that, buddy?
Yeah, I think up front, I would just say, yeah, I think that the multiverse theory is probably one of the strongest theories out there of how our universe actually works. Just to nerdgasm all over the podcast real quick, I just heard for the first time ever, because like we talk about these ideas and these experiences and stuff, and they kind of like get regurgitated. Like, yeah, everyone's heard about this theory or that theory, and we kind of just like spin them. But I actually heard like a brand new one recently, and that's always exciting when you hear something new. That's this idea that every electron in the universe, whenever scientists or like whoever is looking at them, when they actually are measuring the electrons, every single electron that is looked at is literally identical, like 100% identical to every single other electron. There's no variation in measurement or distance or like difference whatsoever. So one theory that came out of that is it's possible that every electron in the entire universe is the same electron. it's Think about how heavy that is for a second. There's only one electron, real electron in the entire universe, and there's some, underneath the fabric of reality and time and space that is allowing them to either be replicated or duplicated or entangled or whatever, or stretched, however you want to say it. But, another theory, like a more subjective theory that comes out of that kind of touches on the multiverse where, there are just layers upon layers upon layers all the way down to that idea of string theory where everything is kind of vibrating in a way in this like three-dimensional space, but inevitably it comes from particles and waves and energy turning into solid matter and et cetera, like all that E equals MC square stuff. But to go back to kind of pull back from the nerd ism there, I think that like when you talk about pockets in the universe where you have high gravity, say like around stars or even like black holes, another theory about that is if you have a black hole or like heavy gravity, that might be a point in space time where you have this rift into another universe. And some people even kind of theorize that black holes are shooting energy or passing energy from one universe into another. And I think that kind of plays into the multiverse theory. So absolutely, like I think like the science is there to explore this idea that there's a multiverse. But the more interesting question is, what does that mean for us in our day-to-day lives and these strange occurrences where we, people talk about the Mandela effect, like things seemingly split off. Like everyone's favorite example is like going back to 2019 when everything kind of just like all the shit hit the fan with proverbially like with the COVID happening and everyone's like, this doesn't feel real and all that stuff. And I don't know, what are your thoughts, man? I kind of riffed for a while there.
I think that the multiverse theory is plausible. Correct me if I'm wrong, but scientists have said that it's kind of a definite possibility that there are multiple universes or at least parallel universes. And I think that these universes can inadvertently interact with one another by
Yeah,
accident. I always think back to the example of the man from Torrid. You remember that?
vaguely. What was that again? Can you remind me?
So it was this dude that flew into I think Tokyo's International Airport, if that's what it's called. I don't know the name of it. You went to Japan, so let me know if that's correct.
Yeah, so there's 2 airports in Tokyo. There was, Haneda and Narita, but yeah, the, flew into Tokyo.
Yeah, so he flew into Tokyo and he's going through customs and he goes to the desk and he gives them the passport and they look at the passport and it says Torrid, like whatever of Torrid, like Republic or something or Kingdom of Torrid. And they're like, we've never heard of Torrid before. So they take him to the back and he's like pointing on a map of where present day Andorra is in Europe between Spain and France. He's pointing at the space on the map and be like, that's Torrid. That's not Andorra. Here's my passport. Here's everything. So they don't believe him. They post him at a hotel and then he like just disappears. So some dude trying to get along with a fake passport from a fake fucking country, or is
Yeah.
that one of those cases where someone just kind of slipped into our universe or timeline? And it's a very interesting concept to me.
That reminds me of, I'm gonna butcher this story, talked about it before, probably in the, episode that, Eric is referencing, but there's that other example where I think it was like was a Ukrainian or way back in the day, like he showed up with some papers or something that he came from the past or something like that, and everything looked
Yeah,
to be in order.
he
It was
showed up like in the 2000s with like
yeah,
paperwork from the 50s from the Soviet Union,
yeah.
and they like cross-referenced it and it was actually legitimate
Listen,
documentation.
I'm gonna put my tinfoil hat on like hardcore right now. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that there have been across many countries who have nearly unlimited resources, especially like larger countries. I'm not going to name countries, but you just use your imagination. Um, we can say Soviet Union because they're gone, but I have no
Are
doubt
they
in my mind.
really?
In another universe, I mean,
According
like
to The
there's
Simpsons, they're coming back.
I know, yeah. I mean, people have already thought about the shit we're talking about, and they made like comedy shows about them where like, there's like some alternate reality and like the Soviets won or something. And I think Simpsons did it, American Dad did it. So not a new concept, but I have no doubt in my mind at all that these weird things we talk about, like there's at least one of them, if not all of them, have been deeply studied and explored by very big heads in very deep parts of the ground in random countries of the world who have very deep resources or a very broad range of resources where everything is driving, like whatever purpose you want to say is driving these studies or whatever, like it's always fear and trying to beat somebody else to the punch when it comes to weapons. But I would bet any money that governments have been looking at ideas of like how time overlaps and how time really works, and how quantum entanglement might work with things slipping between, like Eric said, like thinner parts of the veil of the universe. We were mentioning where maybe that's like where high gravity is around stars, but we can also replicate similar conditions. Scientists on Earth like made the hottest ever recorded point like hotter than like a billion or a million or something stars. Like in one point, it was like 500 million degrees or something crazy like that. So like these things are able to be replicated in the lab, and I don't think that there's any question. So it'd be really interesting, like it'd be so funny if like that guy who shows up in Japan, or this kid who shows up from like in modern day from like the 1950s, like these people kind of do get exposed to these tests or trials, and they slip through the cracks, so to speak, and they then they get pulled away, because I think both of those guys disappeared. So like when I think about that story about the guy like showing up in Tokyo with that weird passport, it's like, why would somebody fabricate that so hard? Like you know, he wasn't trying to pitch anything. He wasn't trying to sell anything. He didn't become famous from it. So it would probably take a really strange person to go through such a significant amount of work to make something like that happen. But yeah, that's the last thought I'll have on that, I guess.
Yeah, to tack onto that, the dude actually had like legitimate traveler's checks from JP Morgan, not JP Morgan, Chase Bank at the time. And it was just, it's like,
Chase is in every reality, goddamn it.
I know.
Everything.
But thank you, Eric, so much for that email. We appreciate it. Our next email comes from Danielle. Again, Danielle, thank you for sending your email. Hi, Chris and Dean. I've been a long time listener to real life ghost stories. Recently, Emma hosted Chris on an episode, and that's how I found TWR. Again, thank you, Emma, for having us on Real Life Ghost Stories. Anyone listening to this that has not listened to Real Life Ghost Stories, Emma puts out a great show, and it's totally awesome, and it was fun being on her show. So if you haven't already, go give it a listen. Danielle continues, I listen at work, and yesterday, one TWR episode was the one on time slips. I know you've covered those a lot, Emma, and I really enjoy hearing the stories because it freaks me out. So I'm doing my thing working, listening to Chris and Dean go back and forth about different theories. Then an idea hit me. What if, instead of traveling in a linear path back or forward in one timeline only, there are multiple simultaneous timelines, only in some of the others, they are at a different point in evolution than what we know as our present timeline. For example, someone isn't born in their timeline, and so that person wasn't able to invent or create a particular thing that has gotten us to where we are today. Like, say, Henry Ford never made it to adulthood and didn't progress the automotive industry to the level it is today. Or Alexander Graham Bell didn't invent a way to communicate long distances. Now, someone else could have stepped in and made those discoveries, but at a different point. So when you experience a time slip, and the subjects there seem to see you and realize you are different, it's all in the same forward moving time, but on totally different planes. In ours, we have technology, but say in the timeline next to us, they haven't quite gotten there yet. I'm really hoping this made sense the way it did in my head. Anyway, I really enjoy listening to both real life ghost stories and TWR. Helps the day go by in a very entertaining way. Let me know what you think. Danielle. Thank you, Danielle, for that email. And Dean, what are your thoughts on the theory that Danielle proposed about simultaneous timelines? For me, it just makes me think to Dragon Ball Z, where you had Future Trunks' timeline, and then you had the timeline he came back to.
Nerd.
Shut the fuck up.
Trying to go Super Saiyan over there.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Danielle. To be honest with you, I'm so self-deprecating. I like, as I'm reading your email, you had the sentence there where you're like, so I'm doing my thing working, listening to Chris and Dean. And then in my mind, as before I kept reading, I was expecting to read, go prattling on about bullshit. And then, Chris and Dean just going off like a bunch of idiots. And then I had this brilliant idea. But thank you for that. That gave me a chuckle, reminding myself how silly things are sometimes. But I think this is actually a very brilliant insight. This is another example where I've come across a brand new concept that I've never thought about before. And I think it works. I think it fits for sure. And to tack on to that, maybe a reason why we have these stories of time slips where something is kind of marginally different. Like a guy comes from a reality, shows up at an immigration desk or something in Japan, and he comes from a reality that clearly has our current banking structure. The other countries still exist. Japan still exists, other whatever. But like his country, smaller, is different. He comes from a timeline that has all those other things the same, except that country is different. So it would make sense that if there was a slip, the slippage from one of the unlimited number of realities would have to kind of closely mimic our reality in order for something to kind of get crossed over. I don't think that there's ever any stories, there could be, but like of a time slip where like somebody just reports seeing just absolute anarchy, just absolute shenanigans, that things just do not make sense whatsoever. Like people's skin is purple, or, buildings are like some weird sequence of colors or something that no one would ever paint, real, whatever, like whatever your imagination is like. But I think that all of the examples we talk about, like things are relatively similar to this reality. So maybe that might account for why or how scientifically things can slip in from other realities into this one. There has to be more of a closely aligned experience. So, like to flip it back to Danielle's examples, like Alexander Graham Bell didn't invent the phone or communication long distance. So, like people went over. Actually, you know what a good example would be that you can talk about, Chris, is the burning of the Library of Alexandria. That's your jam, man. So in her example, maybe there's a reality where Graham Bell or Henry Ford or whatever, like they didn't invent the car or the phone, and that set our civilization back by 100 years or something like that. So in the same timeline where that is missing and eventually someone created it, it could be that we would be in like the 60s right now compared to where we're actually at in 2024. But in the burning of Alexandria, it's a similar concept where imagine a reality where that burning didn't happen and all of those precious scripts with all of those ways of thinking and methods of producing whatever, all that stuff wasn't lost. We would be 1,000 years more advanced right now. So do you want to talk about that real quick?
Scholars have claimed that when the Library of Alexandria burnt down, there were multiple. One happened in a battle where Alexandria was under siege and Julius Caesar was part of that. They kind of blame him for that. They make the claim that cost us a lot of knowledge from the ancient world, and that the ancient world was slightly more advanced than people understood it to be. And I'm not saying like they had fucking cars or stuff like that, but I'm saying like if you look at the ruins of Pompeii, they found a boiler system. They had heated floors. The Romans had plumbing. Now imagine a world in which they could have just kept building on that. But unfortunately, we lost the library. Then we had the Middle Ages where all those fucking morons picking apart aqueducts and shit like that. Dude, don't get me started because I'll just fucking rant. And then, like, you had the kind of, I would say, the first recorded steam engine or turbine, which was an aeolipile. Aeolipile. It's called Heron's engine. Okay, I'm
Oh, you're
struggling
drunk.
here.
Aioli,
I'm not
aioli,
even drinking.
Aaron's engine.
I'm not even drinking. Okay, and it was like in ancient Greece. It was a steam turbine which spins when the central water container was heated. Torque is produced by the steam jets exiting the turbine. And the Greek Egyptian mathematician and engineer hero of Alexandria described the device in the first century AD, and many sources give him the credit for its invention. Now imagine the Industrial Revolution happening 2,000 years ago.
Yeah,
With
that's
that,
insane.
that could technically be an alternate timeline, like Danielle suggested. So, it goes both ways. There could be a timeline where, Henry Ford died and we didn't get the automobile as advanced as they are today.
Mhm.
But alternatively, there is a timeline in which the Library of Alexandria wasn't burnt down and we're probably 1,000 years more advanced. So it's an interesting concept.
And another crazy thing to tack on to that is I think that if you think about it logically, like I was saying earlier, it's unlikely. It seems unlikely if there are such a thing as is such a thing as like a time slip. It would have to be the timelines would have to be relatively similar to have those whatever underlying causal chains or whatever that are going to affect each other and kind of cause a bleeding over. But I think that if you think about it, like Alexandria, the burning was a long time ago, and you're talking about like thousands of years going by or whatever that we might have even been set back that much. But I think as you get away from an event in a timeline, and things just progressively are they become more or they become less and less similar from that original inflection point. I think that, like, what you're saying is if the burnings of Alexandria didn't happen and we could be potentially 1,000 years plus advanced from where we are now, I think the further out you get, the less likely that that other reality is gonna slip into ours because, um, you're talking about spaceships leaving the Earth 1,000 years from now. I have no doubt in my mind that if we're still around, that we will be out in at least the solar system, if not beyond the solar system, with really massive ships for travel and stuff. So I think as you get further away from a certain um, inflection point in reality or in a reality, I think it becomes less likely that there's going to be bleed over. But I also wonder why there aren't more stories of technologies or instances of people viewing technologies that might be kind of similar to our reality. Like no one I don't think I've ever heard of a story of someone reporting seeing a flying car like 30 years ago or something. There has to be some kind of like mimicry going on if that does happen or like something strange. But I do have a really quick side story to share. When I was a kid, I remember seeing a plane to this day. I have no idea what kind of plane it was. It wasn't a UFO. It looked kind of like a plane. And I've spent hours in the past like doing research into military aircraft just to see if I could find this thing. But it basically looked like a really long, narrow fuselage, but it had like an arrow-like cockpit. So just imagine a big arrow, like the points flaring out, coming to like a tri-point at the tip. The windows on the top kind of wrapped around in kind of like a futuristic way, like kind of like bubbly, so to speak. But the wings were like way in the back. And it almost like if you had the wings any further back and the fuselage was thinner, it looked like a freaking rocket. But I remember seeing this over Western Pennsylvania when I was like, I don't even know, like 9, 10, 11 years old, and I saw it for like only a few seconds. It was traveling so fast. But to this day, I have no idea what aircraft that was. The reason I bring it up is because it makes me wonder like that it could have been a time slip. Like I could have seen a technology that was kind of similar to our reality in terms of like flying in airplanes or something. But we hear stories about people flying over the Bermuda Triangle and seeing weird things or losing track of time. So that'd be crazy if like an airplane traveling through airspace suddenly pops into another reality and then pops out. We should actually do a pod about that sometime, like those weird instances of things happening in the sky. And maybe we can also like touch on UFO ideas and whatever. But sorry, that's kind of like a side rant.
All good, man. I enjoyed this quick discussion that we had. Thank
Yeah.
you very much to listeners Eric and Danielle for reaching out to us. And folks, if you have a question for us like they did, we welcome them. And we wouldn't mind creating a little, mini episode or having something similar attached to other episodes when we have questions or thoughts from our listeners. So if you want to reach out to us like Danielle and Eric did, our email address is twroadpodcast@gmail.com. Our contact information is always in our episode descriptions. So please do reach out to us. We really appreciate it. And another thank you to Danielle and Eric for reaching out to us.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Please keep sending questions.
All right, man. Now we can move on to the main topic of the show, which is me finally sharing my full story 75 episodes later. I think that's a good wait, right? You don't just bombard people with that shit right away. For anyone listening to this, Dean and I have been on a couple of other podcasts, like JJ's podcast, where I shared some stories. I was recently on Emma's podcast, Real Life Ghost Stories UK, where I shared some stories on there as well. So I do apologize if this comes as being repetitive. So we'll go ahead and get started. Do
Yeah,
the
sorry, man.
honors.
So I'll start. I'll kind of play the interviewer for this since you were so gracious enough to do that for me last time. Let's start. I feel like a psychiatrist. Like, let's start from the beginning. Where did it all started when I was 10? Probably the best place to go in the beginning would be to talk about your progression from your youth. Cause I know you talked about how you were like an atheist for a while and then you had these experiences that kind of expanded your mind but you also grew up in a home that had different religions, different religious ideas that I think a lot of people growing up don't have. You either have no religion or you have one religion for most people, I would guess. So that's pretty cool that you can add that perspective as well. But like, let's start on the broader theme of like, what was life like for you when you were really young? Like, how did it shape you getting into these experiences, do you think?
That is a good question. So, like I said before, my background is a little different from some other people. I was exposed to different cultures and religions very early on in my life. So that kind of paved the way for me to ask more questions than the average kid would ask, if that makes sense. Seeing your mom pray as a Catholic and then go to see your grandmother and she has a freaking altar of like pictures and little statuettes of all these Hindu deities. It's like, oh, what is this? What is the difference between that? What is actually true? I'm shitting you not. Those are things that I actually thought of when I was 5 years old. I've always been, that type of kid, always inquisitive, always
Deep thinker,
open
yeah.
minded. Yeah, a deep thinker, I would say. I've always been called an old soul.
Yeah, that's weird. Me too, actually. And I think even though I grew up in a different type of home, I also can resonate. I think that's probably why we're friends. Like we have similar ways of thinking and we grew up in like a similar mindset. My curiosity didn't come from your experience where you were exposed to these things and you had questions. Mine was like I wasn't exposed to these things. And that's why I had questions because I wanted to know more about them. But the part 2 to that question for you is when you had that curiosity and you sought out those answers, did you think you went in with like a mindset already made up, or were you really open-minded and unsure about wait, what made the most sense to you? And I'll tell you really quickly, the reason I'm asking this, and not to be boring or sidetrack, the reason I'm asking this is because I think it's going to play deeply into when you talk about the actual paranormal experiences and you talk about how you psychologically I just had deja vu. How you psychologically like set yourself up for these experiences or how you reflect on them, like going back, looking at them going back. So, how do you think, like, the last boring question I'll ask to reiterate is do you think that you were ready to go into these experiences with an open mind, or do you think you kind of already had your mind made up about how life worked and you were just kind of poking around, so to speak?
I mean, a bulk of the experiences, well, I had quite a few before I was a teenager, but a good chunk of them happened in my teen years, well, during my teen years. And
Formative. Yeah. Very
yeah,
formative.
my formative years, to be honest with you, I always had an open mind about stuff. I was never married to one thought or type of belief or anything of that sort.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm Catholic now because for personal reasons that are tied directly to what I experienced. Overall, I've always kept an open mind about everything because I was always the academic. I wanted to know more. Like I've always taken the road of Socrates, saying that I know nothing. So how much can I learn throughout that process? Which is why I am the way that I am right now. And I'm so receptive to not only listening to other people's stories, but willing to talk about my own because people go through shit. And who am I to be so close minded to saying, well, that didn't fucking happen to you because I believe this. I'm like, no, man, there's so many things that happen throughout the world that we don't fucking know. We cannot explain.
I think that's why shows like this are so popular. Hopefully our show, but like other shows as well that talk about these things. Like you said, people have these experiences and like our whole goal for this podcast from the beginning has been to create like a safe space for people to listen to other people's experiences. And I mean, we talked about this like a couple episodes ago with can't remember which guest it was, but this idea that most people keep this stuff suppressed, like because you especially dudes, right, guys, like they
It
might
was
experience something.
last week with it was our most recent episode with Kristen,
Oh, that's
where
right.
she
Okay.
said she kept the
Yeah.
her shit suppressed for 20 fucking years.
Yeah, right. So I think it's great that we're going to talk about this today from your perspective because maybe it'll warm people up to opening up and sharing their ideas and experiences. And I think it's therapeutic, right? Like it's not just therapeutic for you to think about it and say it yourself, but it's also therapeutic to hear other people who have gone through similar experiences and you feel less alone. So let's kick it off with what's that one seminal moment that pops into your mind that like holy shit, that was strange, unexplainable, that really drives these experiences for you.
Okay, I will start all the way from the beginning. When I was a wee lad of 5 years old, maybe 5 to 6 years old, right? This is an interesting one because a couple weeks ago, I talked to my mom about this and I told her the experience. And I'm like, Mom, do you remember this? And to paint the picture, I grew up in the Bronx, New York. I lived there up until the late 90s. And the apartment building that we lived in, we lived on the fourth floor. So the way that the room was set up, when you walked into the bedroom, it was just this one big ass room. That's where I slept, my parents slept, and my sister. To the right was where all the beds were. My side of the bed was, I would say, the upper right corner of the room, closer to the window. And directly across from the beds was a dresser, a vanity, a little TV stand, and there was just one big ass window. I would say it had to have been probably 2 or 3 in the morning. Everyone was asleep at the time. I wake up, I look directly at the vanity, which my parents still have, and I see these like 5 miniature looking type of creatures. To me, they look like the size of gnomes or dwarves or something
Whoa.
equivalent in the fantasy world. When you look into them, there are stories of things, similar things, Hispanic or Latin American culture called duendes, where they're these little things. I don't know if they like terrorize kids or something of that sort.
Are they
So
humanoid like, or what do they look like exactly?
I
Skinny, fat?
I don't remember. I just
Oh,
saw
okay.
like the outline of like the shadows or something like that.
It
So
was dark in the room?
yeah, it was dark. Yeah, it was like
Oh,
2, 3
okay.
o'clock in the morning and everyone was
Weird.
sleeping. I see them and I'm 5, 6 years old at the time. I'm like, "Hey, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. You need to get out of here. Why are you in here? You're not supposed to be here." And then my mom wakes up and she's like talking to me in Spanish. She's like, "Chris, what are you yelling at? It's whatever o'clock. Like, what are you doing? Go to sleep." My mom was irritated, understandable. I look over and they're gone. That's the earliest experience that I ever had when it came to the paranormal, I would say. What's interesting is that a couple weeks ago, I called my mom and I was just talking to her, and for some reason, this came up. And I was like, Mom, do you remember when I woke up at 2, 3 in the morning yelling at whatever, saying I saw these little people or gnomes or something like that, or duendes? And she's like, Oh, yeah, I do. And I'm like, Was it that one time? She's like, No, this happened a couple times. And she's like, One time I was in the kitchen with your sister because she couldn't sleep and she was crying. So your dad had to wake up early. So I went and stayed in the living room or in the kitchen or whatever. And then she said one of the times I was crying and I didn't want to go back to sleep. She stayed with me and she's like, No, I'm going to stay with you. Nothing's going to bother you. So I thought it was a fucking one off. But here, when I talked to her, she's like, This happened a couple of times, dude. It's not just
Wow.
one time that this happened. So that was in the apartment in the Bronx. It wasn't until we moved to the two-family home in Queens, New York. Like I said, it was like the late 90s, so it's probably 98, 99. With that two-family home, my aunt, uncle, and my cousin, they lived on the downstairs. We lived in the upstairs part of the apartment. So I'll tell a quick side story my mom told me. This is early on when we moved in, and my mom had to go to work, and my aunt, one of my mom's sisters, stayed with my sister to watch her. And when my mom came back from work, my aunt told my mom, You have visitors in this home. And my mom was like, What do you mean? Like, did somebody come over? She's like, No, you have visitors in this home, implying that there's stuff there already. There's like a spirit or something there. Because that's the thing with my aunts, they can all feel and hear that shit. So that's my mom's first introduction that there's something there. What I experienced, my first experience in that home that I remembered, when we all moved in, my aunt and uncle had this like old stereo system. And the weirdest shit happened was that it turned on by itself, full fucking blast. Turned on, full blast. And you chalk it up to being like, okay, it's old. It's probably old. There's probably some electrical malfunction. There's something going on. Yeah. So we fucking unplug the thing and then it's still like fucking like we go back upstairs, do whatever we do, full blast again. They get a new stereo system, brand new, right out the box. Not like a week later, that shit fucking turns on full blast again.
Those duende, they love music, man.
Right? Yeah.
I want to capture real quick, like, I mean, this is probably something that is going to be a continuing theme in the questions I have, but what went through your mind? Because if this was me, I'll tell you like what would probably go through my mind because you've already experienced something strange. You tried to write it off at least once, if not a couple times. You got this new system. You unplugged the old system and it turned back on. You got a new system. Same thing's happening. Whenever this happened, this last example you gave, where it's a new system and you're upstairs, no one's touching it, it turns on by itself. Did you have like a moment where you're like, "Oh fuck, like this is real," or were you still trying to like write it off as something technologically going like haywire?
Being 9 to 10 years old at the time, I just didn't get it. I was like, okay, maybe there's something wrong with the wiring in the house. Maybe it's something electrical. Who knows? I wasn't at that point where I thought, yeah, there's something weird going on here. I was not at that point.
Yeah.
But to continue, so common occurrences that would happen in that home every day, and this would amplify at night. You'd hear fucking footsteps in the attic going back and forth. Sometimes it would be slow, sometimes it would be fast. My uncle and my dad and my mom would be like, "Oh no, those are the squirrels, those are the pigeons." And I'm like, "What fucking pigeons are stomping around in boots? Are they wearing fucking Timberlands?" Like, and
Maybe in Brooklyn.
we're in New York, so maybe they have Timberlands on. I don't fucking know. I can assure you, those are not fucking pigeons and squirrels. So very early on, you had the adults saying, like, this is just me thinking back. They're probably like, God damn it, this is some weird shit going on here. What do we tell the kids so they don't get scared? And it's not like we can move because it's not financially viable. It's one of those things, dude. Every fucking night you would hear those footsteps going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in the attic. It wasn't a little home. So it was a good stretch of floor up there in the attic where you would hear it. And on top of that, you would hear at our door.
Yeah. Deliberate knocking.
And it was always always three knocks. I'm 10, 11 years old at the time. I'm like, oh, look, someone's at the door. I go open the door. There's nobody there. I look in the hallway. I look downstairs. There were times where I went downstairs and the door to where my cousin and aunt and uncle lived was locked. Jiggle the handle. It's dark in there. There's nobody home. Clearly, there's nobody home. So that happened a few more times. And one time this happened and my dad got up and was like, I'll answer it. So he goes and he opens the door and there's nobody there. And it's like, Dad, we told you there was nobody there. Like, I don't understand. It's one of those things. I can't explain it, but it's one of those few things when I look back on it now, you think of it innocently because you're a kid.
Yeah. Something was going on for a while. Yeah.
Something was going on there.
Can you describe really briefly the home?
So the home itself was one building, but it was split off into like a duplex type of thing where the bottom was my aunt and uncle and cousin living there. And you would go up the stairs and we would live up there. We shared one main doorway, but we each had our own entrances to the home.
But the rest of the home was like detached from any other surrounding buildings, right? Like,
it was okay. No, not connected to any buildings. Nothing.
Yeah, that makes it creepier, right? Because then you have to write off in that instance, like, oh, you weren't living in a place where you're connected to other units or other people living there other than your immediate family, who you said weren't around or weren't home when these things were happening. So that's crazy. You hear these things incessantly, pounding, knocking, pacing. I'm assuming your parents went up into the attic to make sure no one was like hiding up there. I mean, the only last thing that you could probably write off at least some of it, not the knocking, maybe like the boots thing in the attic was maybe like, piping can knock. Old piping can knock off and on. I've actually been in homes that are old where you hear the pipes. There's air in the pipes that are passing through and they're knocking, they're vibrating.
Those old piping systems, the old school heating systems, when you would turn it on and it's like someone hitting the pipe with another pipe.
Yeah. I remember that. There's no doubt in my mind that something weird was going on. I'm just trying to help you feel better about.
Oh no, listeners, you can't see the expression on my face, but Dean is looking at me like I have my hands in my face, like my eyes are closed, like just reliving the entire freaking thing, and it's just
Did you ever see anything again after the Duende incidents that you told like talked about? Because you've had a lot of. I know you're going to get to this one, but you've seen things happen like your family member getting shoved back out of nowhere. But have you ever seen anything again in that home, like any specters or it's just been invisible forces making sounds and throwing people around?
I have not seen anything. But listeners, I did interview my cousin Cassandra and my sister, and whatever was there actually presented itself to them. And my sister had an imaginary friend named Andy. Fortunately for me, I never saw anything. It was more so where I would have instances where it was just irritating. Like it would try to get my attention. It would make those noises, bang on the door. You would hear the footsteps in the attic. The footsteps in the attic made way to actually footsteps in our apartment. So the footsteps, this would happen probably, I don't know, like 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. It would go from all the way to the front, walk to the dining room, to the entrance of the kitchen, and then it would walk back and forth. I was a light sleeper and my mom is a light sleeper. My mom would be the one to wake up. And then one night when it happened, my dad was awake. He didn't I don't know if he didn't believe her at the time or something of that sort. I'm not gonna put words in his mouth because they listen to the show, so I'm gonna be nice. Um, so I don't know what prompted him. Maybe he heard the footsteps, maybe he was just awake the entire time. So the footsteps happened again. He was like, "Look, I'll go this time." He goes and he hears the footsteps. And you're in that type of situation and you're a father, Dean. I'm sure if you were in that situation, you'd be really fucking pissed off because you are thinking about protecting your children. He starts swearing, the agitation tactics that you're not supposed to do, like they say in those ghost hunting TV shows.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that happens. Before I segue into some of the creepier things, do you have any questions?
It'd be so cool to get your parents on, talk
Oh,
about
yeah.
their perspective on this stuff. Like, yeah, your dad saw a ghost. He took a swing at it, and now he has something hanging around him the rest of his life. No, but
See,
yeah,
we
that's
never
really
really
crazy.
talked to him about it. My mom, yeah.
Yeah,
We never really talked to him about it because it
you
was
should
like
ask your dad about that stuff more often because I know like I feel like typically guys experiencing that would they would be closed off, but as you get older, I think that maybe you get lucky and he'll share more. But that'd be cool to ask him about that.
but yeah, so that's the whole footstep fiasco. And before I forget, I think from when I last spoke with my aunt, the previous owner did pass away in the home and they kind of sold the home as is. And some of the furniture was kept. But to me, that's kind of a big no no because I personally think that if you keep old furniture, that kind of creates a little haven for whatever energies are attached to them or whatever thing was attached to them to stick around. I don't know if the furniture in this case actually played much of a big part because I personally think whatever is there and whatever is still there is not something that's human. As JJ would say, it's something of the infernal. It's something very powerful because it got physical with some family members in the home. And that's something that I cannot explain. Like, I don't understand how to explain it. I don't understand any type of physics. I would love to go back in time and take Neil deGrasse Tyson there and be like, dude, explain this to me. How did that happen? And I'll tell you what happened because I've referenced this a few times before. It was probably in the summertime because my sister was home, I was home, my mom was home from work. Our aunt had moved in with us, my dad's sister. To paint the picture, when you go into the kitchen leads directly to like a little square hallway. When you walk into that hallway, if you're walking in from the kitchen, to the left is the entrance to the bathroom. To the right is the closet door where we kept towels and blankets and stuff. Slightly to the left is the door to my room. Right next to that was the door to my parents' bedroom. My sister was standing in the doorway of my bedroom. My aunt walks out of my parents' room. She turns right, opens the bathroom door, steps foot in the bathroom door, and gets violently shoved into the closet door. She didn't slip. There was no wind or anything. because she was a good foot off the ground and she traveled quite a few feet back. Crazy is I talked to her a little bit ago and I just brought it up and she started laughing maniacally. She's like, "Oh, what that pushed me." You get to a point where it's almost 20 years later that you laugh about it. But in the moment and you think back on it, it's like, what the fuck was so strong that it had the ability to do that to some? And I will say this because I didn't mention this at the start of the story. My aunt did say that she would hear voices in that home. She would hear the footsteps. She would hear the knocking as well. And my aunt was Christian, well, is Christian. Whatever was in there didn't like her. Whatever was in there didn't like my grandmother because my grandmother was a devout Hindu. She prayed every day. She would wake up before sunrise and she would pray and make her offerings. So that was one of the, I would say, experiences in that home that will be forever burned into my memory.
So I've heard this story several times before and it's always creepy, but I think it's interesting how your aunt responded when you finally brought it up again. It's good that she like can write it off and like kind of play it off as like, oh, like that thing. But we always inevitably come back to this idea that a force that has strength or capability to affect other things in this third dimensional space. I remember growing up, like people would call that, I don't know if this is technically true, but when I was growing up and people would talk about you'd say you have ghosts and ghosts can't affect anything in the physical plane. Like they're ethereal, they're just floating around. Like the ghosts are ghosts, they can't do anything. They just show up and you see them sometimes, but that's it. Poltergeists, though, poltergeists are the ones that can mess with this reality and hurt people, shove people, all that stuff. I want to backtrack for a second to the attic, and that nobody was up there like sneaking the boots on for no reason and pacing around. Or I've heard stories like this where people move into a home and then they find old stuff in the attic. Like for instance, like there was that Robert the Doll episode we did a while back where like that woman ended up buying the house and she found Robert the Doll in the attic. It was just left up there. And I just think it's so like funny that that can happen where like you buy a house and you move into it and you don't like go looking upstairs, or like how do you not find that shit? If I moved into a house where someone previously owned, and it was, especially if it was old, I would be tearing that shit apart, like looking for the most interesting stuff I could find. But it's always funny to hear stories like, oh, I moved into this home that's like 100 years old and I've been living here for a decade and I just happen to now find something in the attic that, like I stumbled across. That kind of seems like a red flag to me too, like something just popped out of nowhere. But the shoving instance is clearly a whole other level than the knocking and pacing and whatnot. And I like how you flavored the story with it didn't like the people in your life in that home, probably because of what they believed in or the type of people that they were. So I think that gives some credibility to the fact that this is like a really malevolent force that just doesn't like goodness or just pissed off at its existence. But it's interesting that it came out in the shoving of your aunt. Now, were there ever any other stories like this or occurrences like this that were focused on your aunt when she came over? Or was this like a one-off, like it never seemed to bother her again sort of thing?
So my aunt lived with us for a little bit and she would hear voices call her name. She would hear the knocking. Same thing that I
Oh, creepy.
experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she never liked being there alone because she would watch my sister when my sister was younger and my aunt would pick her up from school. But my mom recently told me that my grandmother experienced quite a few things. And my grandmother passed away in 2008. My grandfather passed away, I believe, in 2004. So we're probably pushing 20 years now. Crazy. It's just upsetting because they were old. They were in their late 70s. They couldn't do anything. They could barely fucking walk. Like my grandfather had to walk with a cane. He was sick. So I don't know what my grandfather experienced because he wasn't very mobile. And if he didn't have someone to help him up the stairs, yeah, he had a cane. He couldn't really move around much. He could walk to the kitchen, bathroom, whatever, right? My grandmother never had that issue. But the one thing that my mom told me and my sister corroborated this story was that my grandfather had passed away. So it's just my grandmother living in the basement alone. And she would have I don't know if these are nightmares or something of that sort. prophesizing that something's going to happen to someone and then it would happen, right? So that would happen while my grandmother was sleeping. Something would literally throw water in her face, she said. She said that she would hear these voices screaming at her while she's trying to sleep. And she said to my mom, they don't let me sleep. I can't sleep. They don't let me sleep. So who knows how long this went on for. I don't know if this happened while my grandfather was still around. I don't know if he experienced anything or heard anything because, I never thought to ask him and I'll never be able to ask them. So I apologize. It's just a little frustrating,
Yeah.
thinking back to what they could have potentially went through in that place. But I'll tell you a story I haven't shared yet. And this happened while I was out of the country. So this happened in the Dominican Republic. So me and my mom and my sister, and I think it was like December of 2003 or so 2004. It was in August. We went to the Dominican Republic for a couple of weeks, right? So we went to go see where my mom grew up. They had just recently, the sisters came together, recently built a house there. So that's where we stayed on the property where my mom grew up. So it was pretty awesome. It was a nice countryside area in the up in the mountains. So you always get warnings as a kid, from the older folks saying like, don't go down this road, don't go do this, don't do that, because you're gonna see something you don't want to fucking see. Well, guess what? I saw something I didn't want to fucking see. So where the house was situated was on a plot of land, obviously, but right up the path was my uncle's house. And in between that pathway, if you go directly to the right, was like a heavily wooded area that a road went through it, a dirt path went through it, but it was probably 100 yards or so to the other side. One night, I freaking walked out of the house and I'm walking, and dude, I stopped in my tracks. I turned right and I looked down that path and I see this figure of what had to have been a fucking Taino Indian standing there staring at me. I ran back to the house. I didn't say anything. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't say anything. Let's fast forward to the summer of 2013. I'm in grad school at the time, so I go back to New York to visit my mom, and my aunt from the Dominican comes to visit. And I remember this like it was yesterday. My mom and my aunt are talking in the kitchen. They're talking about spirits and stuff like that. And then my aunt says something, and I forget exactly what she said. And I'm like, oh, you're describing El Indio. That's what I called it. And she looked at me and she's like, how do you know about that? And I was like, oh, that's the thing that I saw when I was in the Dominican. And she's like, you saw it? And I'm like, yeah, I saw it. And I described it. I was like, it looked like a Taino. He had the cloth on and face like whatever face paint they would do. She's looking at me in disbelief. And essentially she's like, yeah, that's my quote unquote guardian or something of the equivalent.
Weird.
Yeah, yeah. Make of that what you will. I just thought that was fucking creepy that I saw something and nearly a decade later, it just out of chance, it crops up.
Yeah, and then you find out the truth. I think the first thing that really sparks my imagination is well, first of all, the thing that's the guardian that you saw, you didn't know that at the time. You just saw this strange looking figure. That years
Yeah.
later you found out it was, her guardian. I think it's really fascinating because that kind of portend or that kind of like implies that that thing that she believes was watching over here can't travel with her. You said things are pegged to your house, doesn't follow you per se. I like to
Per
like
se.
learn about the rules. You know what I mean? Like the
Yeah. Yeah.
paranormal rules about why is it pegged to one place? That's something that obviously can't be answered. It's just fun to speculate. But then the other thing that really jumped out is the garb that you said and the face paint and all that stuff, like very traditional, going way, way back in the day in the brush, so to speak, of tribal villages and whatnot. And I also think it's fascinating that you either have two things, like either the thing is taking the form of something that it liked the form of in the past, like it saw something in the past, like, oh, I remember seeing these indigenous people. I'm just going to replicate this, and it's, but it's not really the indigenous person that used to live there, or it actually is a spirit of the indigenous person that used to live there, and they're just happening to present themselves how they used to look in a traditional garb or whatever. Isn't that fascinating that you saw something in modern day that was reflective of like things that were happening way, way before? So that kind of implies that these
Time
old
slip.
spirits, like, yeah, time slip, right? It could have
Yeah.
been. Could have been. I did think about that. It's like these things are stuck again in these locations, but not in just locations, but times. So that kind of that's freaky, right? That freaks me out. The idea that if you die and you are this entity that's stuck there, you're stuck like as that person when you die in that form, if that makes sense. And just to see that as a kid, I'm glad you shared that because I haven't heard that story before. And I got one little side one for me. Like I thought that I saw something once in Indonesia years and years ago, and I'm pretty sure to this day it was just shadows or whatever because I think I shined a light over it. It was nighttime, but like you saw something very clearly where it wasn't just an outline like the duende or whatever when you were younger. This was like a very clear, like you can describe it. So unless there's somebody traipsing around in traditional garb where you were visiting or whatever, like just for funsies, I don't know. I mean, that seems extremely unlikely. Like maybe you wandered onto an old like taping or recording, like they were doing like a movie shoot and this guy was just an extra and he's just like having a smoke break or something. But no, I think that like you saw something and that's pretty crazy, man. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah, I never really shared that one before. Sometimes I just forget too because it wasn't traumatizing, I would say. It was like, "Holy fuck, I saw this thing. I'm gonna go back inside now." Like, I'm not even gonna attempt to continue to go where I was going because I don't feel like getting fucking stabbed or haunted forever or something like that, you know? So, I did mention previously that my sister had an imaginary friend. What's interesting is that she had an imaginary friend. She named it Andy, or apparently that was its name. She would talk to it, she would interact with it. You know, it was one of those things. Kids have imaginary friends, right? I don't think I ever had one though. My sister's just fucking weird. But but with imaginary friends, they tend to go everywhere the kid is going. This one did not. It had rules. It was bound to a specific locale. And what I mean by that is that one day, me, my grandmother, my sister, and my mom, we were going to go to the grocery store a couple blocks up the street. So my sister is going off on Andy and is like, "Oh, can Andy come? Whatever, blah, 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 blah." So we start to leave the house and we're walking up the street. We get to a certain point and my mom is like, "Oh, is Andy with you?" And my sister's like, "Oh, no, Andy's not here. He had to go back. He can't go past a certain point." And my mom thought that was fucking weird. I was like, "Okay, you don't really think anything of it." Apparently, Andy or something, or whatever the hell that thing was, told my sister that it's stuck there forever. It can't leave that place.
Oh shit.
I'll share another Andy story that my sister shared with me and that my cousin Cassandra also shared with me because they both saw it at the same time. And listeners, if you want to go back and actually hear the stories from them, my sister was on episode 24 and my cousin Cassandra was on episode 20. They said that they went upstairs to our place and they walk into our apartment and my sister and my cousin were going to get their toys, their Bratz dolls. And standing in the hallway, either in the dining room or in the kitchen, I wasn't there, so I can't actually say. But apparently, Andy was standing there and he looked really frustrated. And my cousin and my sister just were like, "Okay, we're gotta go now," and they just leave. Apparently, they said I came upstairs to come and find them, asking them what the hell they were doing, but I really don't remember that. Now, when my sister and my cousin went back to that home in the summer or close to the summer of 2014 because my sister had just graduated from high school and my aunt still lived there and she wanted to throw my sister a barbecue. My sister said that her and my cousin Cassandra went into the house to go and get something. So they went through the front door and I think I said before, when you walk through the front door of the home, you enter this like mini, I don't want to say like, it's kind of like a squarish hallway. Directly to the left is the entrance to my aunt's apartment in the home. And you go through a doorway. Once you get through the doorway to the left, straight down the hallway is the entrance to the basement. Right next to the entrance to that hallway is the stairs to go upstairs. So I apologize if I didn't explain that great. So picture it as you walk through the doorway, stairs right in front of you. To your left is where you could put your shoes and stuff, and directly to the right of that area, continuing down a little stretch of hallway, is the entrance to go down into the basement, a doorway to go down into the basement. So they said they walked in, they went to that area to go take off their shoes. And as my sister was taking her shoes off, my cousin pats her on the shoulder and says, "Do you see that?" And my sister looks up and they both see this tall, had to have been 7-foot black mass
Jeez.
just standing there through that entranceway to the basement. Now, I don't know if it had red eyes or something like that, but they felt like something was just staring into them. So they both put on their shoes and they got the fuck out of there and never went back.
Didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just stood there.
They just, my cousin said that. She was like, "Do you see that?" My sister's like, "Yep." And they just fucking ran off. They just got the fuck out of there. And I know I'm skipping a little bit in the timeline, but it's all just coming back to me and I just need to get it out there before I forget. So recently, my sister, I'd say like a year ago or so, a year and a half ago, she went to New York for a couple months to visit some family. And she was staying at my aunt's house. And her and my cousin decided to go for a walk. And they decided it would be a good idea to walk down the old street that we lived in and to walk by that home. My sister said that when they walked by that home, her and my cousin both got a sharp pain in their head at the same time that did not alleviate until they were at least a block down the road. So whatever that was, knew they were there and did not like them. Unless you have any questions, I'll segue back to some of the things that kind of frightened me to the point where I was like, okay, it's time to go.
And I haven't come across stories like that before where two people simultaneously have like a sharp pain and attribute that to the area where they had paranormal experiences before. I kind of think when I hear something like that, I think about, some people having a predisposition, like maybe a family lineage, more sensitive in their DNA or however they were raised, like developed, their brain developed, like more sensitive to things like that. But I would honestly guess that it's more of like an instance of incompatibility of them being there, like their existence in that area, as opposed to like something actually actively knowing they're there and sending them some pain in their head. It's almost like when you mix water and oil, like the water doesn't know that the oil is there because the water is not sentient. Same with the oil, but they just kind of like don't interact well. They separate. So like I wonder, like maybe that's something that's going on as well, and that's an interesting area to explore.
I'll go into the last few stories that, vividly stick out to me. There were like other instances that happened where my aunt said that she heard footsteps walking back and forth and she called our landline upstairs. For any of the young listeners, yes, we had landlines and nobody answered the phone. And then she went upstairs and knocked on the door and nobody answered the door and she could hear the footsteps walking back and forth. She said she went back downstairs, called my dad's cell phone, and could hear clearly in the background that I was not home, my dad was not home, my mom was not home, my sister was not home. Everyone was at a barbecue at my cousin's place about 6 or 7 blocks away, which would have been about like a 15-minute walk away. She said that she locked herself in the room and just like watched TV until people came home, which I wouldn't blame her. There were other instances where she said she would hear like stomping and stuff at 3 o'clock in the morning coming from my room, because where my room was right above her, and she complained one. There's like they went and checked, and I was like passed the fuck out. And there would be other times where like nobody would be in the room or nobody would be at home, and she would hear stomping and stuff like that. It's not just me that experienced stuff. It's not just my sister that experienced stuff. Everybody that was in that home in some form or fashion had some sort of experience that they can't explain. And I apologize for another side rabbit hole. I just have to get it all out. The common occurrence, which kind of irritated the hell out of me, was I would hear voices call out my name very loudly, like they wanted something from me. It would be in the voices of my parents. So I would hear the voice of my mom calling me. I'd hear the voice of my dad calling me, especially when they're not home. And when I told my mom about it, she was like, that's the dead calling. Don't answer. That's dead people calling for you. Don't answer them." So I'm like, okay. Sometimes you'd forget because you think your parents are actually calling you, and then you go and look, and it's like, okay, fuck. There's nobody there. Slightly terrifying, but I've told this before on other
Best for last.
shows.
Yeah.
I've told this before on other shows. So I was in high school at the time. I came home early. I go to my room, turn on my Xbox, playing whatever the hell I'm playing. There was no one home downstairs. My parents weren't home. My aunt wasn't living with us at the time. My sister was in school at this time. My grandfather had passed away. My grandmother every day would go to like a senior living center. So I'm sitting there and I'm in my room. I'm playing my game, and then I hear what sounds like my mom calling my name. So I don't acknowledge it. I hear it again. And I'm like, okay, this is kind of irritating. I know my mom's not home. I call my mom. She answers her phone. She's outside. She worked in Manhattan, so you could hear the hustle and bustle of the city in the background. And like you could hear kids in the background because my mom was a nanny for the longest time working in Manhattan. And I told her what happened. I was like, "Mom, you're at work, right?" And she's like, "Yeah." Is like everything okay? Yada yada, like a parent would do. And I'd be like, "Mom, I heard you call me. I heard your voice call me." And she's like, "Well, you know not to answer it. Don't pay attention to it. Whatever." So I'm like, okay. I hang up the phone. So I keep playing my game. Then I hear my name called again. I ignore it. But this time, in the doorway between my kitchen and dining room, there was a door that my mom would close while she was cooking to keep the smell from going all over the house. At this point in time, that door was open. It was winter, or at least fall, because this was probably like around November or something like that. My dad liked to plastic up all the windows. Dude, when I tell you I nearly pissed myself, I am not fucking kidding.
Yeah.
That door was completely wide open and it just fucking slams shut.
Wow. Yeah.
I was
From wide
like,
open. Man.
fuck this. So we ended up moving early the next year, like in February, like mid-February. I told my parents, like, look, I don't want to live here anymore. They were already exploring moving, but when your kid tells you, like, look, I don't want to live here anymore, that's kind of like the final straw. Like, okay, we got to get the fuck out of here. And
Did you tell your parents about the door slamming?
oh yeah,
What did they say
oh
about
yeah,
that?
there's nothing they could do.
But they believed
I
you,
mean,
right? Like they believe
oh yeah,
like
my
something
mom
is actually
that something was there. Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. My mom always believed me.
yeah.
There were no windows open. There were plastic over the windows. The
Yeah.
door
No
was
drafts. Yeah,
no
nothing like
drafts,
that.
no nothing for it to just slam like that. And what's crazy is that a summer, like probably a summer prior to that happening, my cousin that lived across the street, I told you about that whole incident where with the picture, him parked in front of the house, him and we're close. We're still really close. So he was over one summer day. It was me, him, and my sister in the room. We were just messing around, playing video games, whatever. And the door was completely closed. My bedroom door was completely closed, dude. And the fucking handle of the door, we watched this fucking thing twist, open by itself. There's nobody there. And this dumbass sticks his hand out and says, "The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you." the power of Christ compels you, and the door closed back on itself. Oh man, it's so fucking crazy. And
Was it you who told me, I'm probably getting this completely wrong, but did you tell me that, was it you that said that you had an instance where you were on your bed and you felt it like lift up, or like you were on your bed with somebody and like your bed moved? Or am I thinking of somebody else? Like your bed lifted up a little bit and fell back down? I think
no,
maybe we
that
were
wasn't
talking to
me.
somebody else. That
That
wasn't you.
wasn't me.
Okay.
If it was me, I'd probably piss myself. But okay, dude, I'll give you the last story that I have that's like related to that household. Well, related to that house, and it's from my mom. So, like I said, like I say multiple times, that my mom is Catholic. So prior to us moving out, I would say like a couple months before we moved out, she like took incense and she had this little urn lantern thing that Catholics have to bless the home, whatever. So she does the upstairs, she goes to my room, everywhere, every room in the upstairs, right? She's fine. So she goes downstairs, and like I've said before on the show, like my uncle and family downstairs were Muslim. So my mom asks permission before she goes and, does the cleansing or whatever you want to call it. And my uncle didn't give a shit. He was like, yeah, that's fine. She goes to every room. Then she gets to one specific room. She starts, spreading the incense, like the smoke, and praying, and she felt like something was like choking her. And then she was like, okay, I need to get out of here. So she leaves that same night. And the only reason I remember this vividly is because the same night she had the dream, she told me the next day. She said that she dreamt of an old lady standing in her bedroom doorway. My mom was still laying in bed in the dream. Everything was still the same, like the house and everything. Whatever it was yelling at my mom, saying, like, are you trying to kick me out of my own effing home? I'm going to effing kill you and your kids, yada, yada, yada. And then my mom said in the dream that she grabbed whatever it was by the neck and pinned it against the wall and said, you're not going to effing kill anybody. You're not going to touch my kids. You're not going to touch my family. If anybody's going to kill anyone, I'm going to kill you. And then it like shape shifted into a little girl to get some sort of sympathy. And then my mom
Mm,
said that she like woke up. So
dude.
whatever was there
Wow.
did not like her.
Do you know what you should do?
Uh,
You should get her to, I mean, maybe you've already done this, but did you ever get her to try to describe the little morphing into the kid? Because would it be creepy if like you can ask your sister and ask your mom if it looked like Andy? If they both describe the same looking, you know what I mean, like little kid sort of thing that your sister said she saw, that'd be interesting.
yeah, yeah, I can definitely ask them, man. And yes, listeners, those are the things that I experience. I've been on other platforms sharing them, and I think being so close to, I guess, 100 episodes, I think it's finally time that I shared it on our show. Any questions before we wrap up today, Dean?
No, man, I really enjoyed this one a lot. I've never heard in depth a lot of these stories, and it was kind of fun to speculate and ask questions and just hear the full tale from you. Like we've been doing a lot of interviews with people and we've been doing stuff where we share our experiences. These stories that we share and that other people share, but I actually enjoy now hearing other people's stories more after hearing your story because now listeners know where you're coming from. They heard you be articulate and share these stories and you don't sound full of shit whatsoever. Like these are real things that you went through. And I'm hoping that people will hear this and hear us and know that we are, like I said earlier, creating a good space for people to come and engage with us and whatever. So please send us your questions. If you thought of something where, you know, a question that I didn't ask Chris when he was bringing up these stories, even if you want to counter something, if you want to play skeptic, that's great. Like we love skeptical conversations as well. So like, please give us your questions. And if you want to, like, try to come on the show if you've got great stories. Thanks for sharing, Chris.
Yep. Thanks for conducting the interview, man. I appreciate it. And like Dean said, listeners, if you would like to be on the show, if you'd like to share your stories like I did today, go ahead and reach out to us. All of our contact information is always in the show description notes. Our email address is twroadpodcast@gmail.com. We appreciate everyone that listened in today, and we appreciate both Eric and Danielle for sharing their questions via email with us. Hope you enjoyed today's episode, folks. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a rating on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please share the show with your friends, as that would help us grow immensely. Also, be sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on TikTok at twrpodcast, our Instagram at twroadpodcast, and our Facebook by searching for The Wandering Road Podcast. If you'd like to get a hold of us, you can reach us at our email address, twroadpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. We would love to have you on the show as a guest so you can share your stories, or you could submit email submissions of your stories that we could dedicate an episode to. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the next one.